Rain falls on black marble, and you don't move to avoid it. You are standing at the edge of a grave that took 11 men to dig deep enough for the kind of casket you insisted on. Steel-lined, mahogany finish, the same craftsmanship you once used to bury enemies with respect they never earned in life. Except this time, the woman inside it was never your enemy. She was your wife. And you are only now beginning to understand that you buried her a stranger. You have spent 19 years reading men the way other men read newspapers. A twitch at the collar. A pause half a second too long before a lie. You have watched grown men, killers, traitors, men who'd slit a throat without blinking, unravel under nothing more than the weight of your silence, because you always knew, before they did, exactly which words they were about to use to betray you. You built an empire on that instinct. Men fear you not because you are the strongest in the room, but because you are always the one who already knows. Except her. For 7 years, once a month, she left a letter on your desk. Folded once, sealed, your name written in handwriting you never let yourself study too closely. And for 7 years, you did the same thing every time. You opened the top drawer, dropped it in without breaking the seal, and turned the lock. You told yourself it was mercy, that reading them would only give her hope you didn't intend to offer. You told yourself a woman who writes that many letters is a woman starving for a conversation you were too disciplined to have. You were wrong. You will learn exactly how wrong in a few minutes, standing here in the rain, when a man old enough to have known your father approaches you with something small clutched inside his coat. He stops in front of you. He doesn't offer condolences. Men like him know better than to waste your time with words that change nothing. Instead, he reaches into his coat and produces a single brass key, dulled with age, resting on his open palm like it weighs more than it should. Your wife asked me to give you this, he says, only after she was gone. You look at the key. You do not reach for it yet. She said the truth would mean nothing. The old man continues, his voice steady even as rain runs down the collar of his coat, until you had no one left to apologize to. Dario Moretti had not raised his voice in 11 years, and he had not needed to. Men who worked for him understood the arithmetic quickly. A raised voice meant weakness, meant a man who needed volume to be believed. Dario had never needed to be believed. He needed only to speak once, quietly, and watch the room rearrange itself around what he'd said. Across northern Italy, his name moved through conversations the way smoke moves through a locked room. Nobody invited it in, but everybody felt it settle. He had inherited the family at 26, after his father was found in a car outside Bologna with 3 bullets and no explanation. Dario never found out who gave the order. He'd simply made certain that within a year, no one would ever consider giving one against him. What men rarely understood about Dario, what even Elena had only partially understood, was that his control hadn't been built. It had been inherited from somewhere darker. His mother had loved his father the way a woman loves a fire she knows will eventually burn the house down, completely, and against her own better judgment. Dario remembered being 9 years old, finding her at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, writing something she folded quickly the moment she heard his footsteps. He remembered asking her what it was. "A letter," she'd said. "For when I have the courage to say what I actually feel." She never gave that letter to anyone. Dario found it 18 years later, after her death, tucked inside a Bible, a confession of a life she'd spent silently unhappy, married to a man who never once asked if she was. Dario had made a decision that day, quiet and absolute the way all his decisions were. Letters were not honesty. Letters were what people wrote when they didn't have the courage to say something to your face. And anything a person didn't have the courage to say directly wasn't worth his time. So when Elena's first letter appeared on his desk, 3 months into their marriage, folded once, his name written in careful hand, he didn't hesitate. He picked it up, studied the seal for exactly as long as it took to recognize what it was, and dropped it into the drawer without breaking it open. "If you have something to say to me," he told her that night, "not unkindly, say it to my face." Elena had only nodded. She never brought it up again. She simply kept writing. Elena Moretti was not the kind of woman who begged. The daughter of a shipping magnate in Genoa, She had been raised in rooms where men negotiated over her head as though she couldn't hear them, and she had learned early that the sharpest tool in any room was patience. When her father arranged her marriage to Dario, a union of two families, two fortunes, two silences that would never speak honestly to each other, Elena hadn't cried. She had simply studied him, the way she studied everything, cataloging him like a language she intended to master. To the outside world, the marriage was a triumph. Elena hosted with effortless grace, stood beside Dario at events with the composure of a woman who belonged there, and never once gave the press or the family a single thread to pull at. Servants described her as kind but unreadable. Dario's men respected her the way they respected him, from a careful distance, aware that calm was not the same as harmless. Behind the doors of the Moretti estate, the marriage was something quieter and colder. Dario provided for her completely and asked nothing of her beyond composure. Elena gave him composure and asked for nothing beyond that. They were, by every visible measure, functional. They were also, by every measure that mattered, strangers who shared a bed. Once a month, on the same date, Elena would sit at the small writing desk in her private study, and she would write. Not quickly, carefully, the way a woman writes something she expects to be read only once, and only by the right person at the right time. She would seal the envelope, walk it to Dario's study herself rather than send it by staff, and place it in the center of his desk, squared perfectly to the edge. She never said anything when she did it. Neither did he. One evening in their 4th year of marriage, she stood in the doorway of his study and watched him pick up that month's letter, study the seal for a moment too brief to mean anything, and drop it into the locked drawer without a word. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask him to read it. She simply nodded once, turned, and left. What Dario never noticed, what no one in that house ever noticed, was that Elena didn't return to her room to grieve the rejection. She returned to her desk, and she began writing the next entry in what she had, for years, been quietly compiling. Not love letters at all, but a record. Dates, names, numbers that didn't add up. Conversations she wasn't supposed to have overheard. She wasn't pleading for his attention. She was building a case file no one was ever supposed to need. The official explanation was her heart. That was what the doctor said, what the death certificate recorded, what Dario repeated to the dozen people who asked him directly, and the 100 more who didn't dare. Elena Moretti, 41 years old, collapsed in her private study on a Tuesday evening and was gone before anyone reached her. No warning. No history of illness. Just a woman found at her writing desk, pen still in hand, a half-finished sentence on the page in front of her. Dario had not asked for an autopsy. Some part of him, the part that had spent 19 years reading danger in every room he entered, had noted the absence of one as strange even as he signed the paperwork himself. He told himself grief was clouding his instincts. He did not let himself finish the thought a second time. The funeral was held on family land, under a sky the color of wet stone, rain falling steadily onto black umbrellas and darker suits. Half of Italy's underworld stood shoulder to shoulder in that field, men who feared Dario Moretti enough to attend a funeral they had no genuine grief for, murmuring condolences that meant nothing and cost them nothing. Dario stood at the head of the grave and felt none of them. He felt only the particular, specific absence of a woman he realized, too late, standing over her casket, he had never actually known. It was as the crowd began to thin, as men filed back toward their cars and practiced respectful silence, that Dario noticed the old man approaching. Giovanni Ricci, the family's lawyer for over 30 years, a man who had drafted contracts for Dario's father and buried 3 generations of Morettis in paperwork and quiet discretion. He had never once, in all those decades, approached Dario without being summoned first. He approached now. He didn't offer condolences. He simply reached into his coat, drew out a small brass key, dulled with age and years of handling, and held it out on his open palm. "Your wife asked me to give you this," Giovanni said, his voice steady despite the rain running down his collar. Only after she was gone. Dario looked at the key. He did not reach for it. "She said the truth would mean nothing," Giovanni continued, each word measured, deliberate, clearly rehearsed years in advance for exactly this moment, until you had no one left to apologize to. Dario's hand moved toward the key. It was shaking. He hadn't felt his own hand shake since he was 26 years old, standing over his father's casket, realizing for the first time that control was something you built, not something you were born with. He took the key anyway. The house was empty by midnight. Dario had sent everyone away, the staff, the guards stationed outside his study, even Matteo, who'd lingered in the doorway an hour longer than necessary before finally leaving him alone. Dario hadn't wanted comfort. He hadn't wanted company. He had wanted exactly what he had now: silence, a single lamp, and a brass key sitting on the desk in front of him like it had been waiting 7 years for this moment. He turned it in his hand for a long time before he used it. The lock gave with less resistance than he expected, a small, almost gentle click, as if the drawer itself had been waiting to exhale. He pulled it open slowly, the way a man opens something he already suspects will change what he understands about his own life. Inside were the letters. Not scattered, not disordered, organized. Stacked by year, each stack bound with a thin ribbon, each envelope labeled not with a name but with a date in Elena's careful hand. Dario stared at them for a long moment, doing the arithmetic without meaning to. 7 years. 12 letters a year. 84 letters, give or take, sitting in a drawer he had personally sealed shut 84 separate times. He had never once asked himself, in 7 years, what might have happened if he'd opened even one. He reached for the earliest stack, the ribbon slightly yellowed with age, and lifted the first envelope free. His name was written across the front in the same hand he'd watched cross that threshold dozens of times, always composed, always unreadable. He broke the seal. The paper inside was thinner than he expected, the ink slightly faded, and for a moment Dario simply held it, aware of his own pulse in a way he hadn't been aware of it in years. Then he read the first line. "If you're reading this, I'm already dead." Dario's breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat and simply stopped there, refusing to move in either direction. He read the 6 words again, certain he had misunderstood them, certain that a letter written years before her death couldn't possibly open with those words unless she had known, even then, exactly how this would end. His hand tightened slightly on the paper. Somewhere in the house, a clock marked the hour, and he didn't hear it. He was aware only of the next line waiting beneath the first, half visible in the lamplight, and of the sudden, specific fear that whatever came next was going to cost him something he wasn't prepared to lose a second time. He held the letter a moment longer. Then he made himself keep reading. The rest of the letter was not what Dario expected. It wasn't sentiment. It wasn't longing, or grievance, or the quiet accusations he'd braced himself for after 7 years of assuming these letters were the private complaints of a lonely wife. What followed the first line was something colder, more precise, dates, observations. A list, almost, written in the same careful hand, but with none of the softness he associated with her. March 14th, Salvatore met with a man from Palermo at the old warehouse. He told you it was about the shipping contracts. It wasn't. I recognized the man. He works for the Calabrians. April 2nd. Money moved through the Genoa account that doesn't match any ledger you've shown me. Small enough that no one would look twice. Large enough, over a year, to matter. April 30th. Someone asked me, at dinner, framed as pleasant conversation, exactly how much you trust Salvatore. I gave them nothing. I wanted you to know, they asked. Dario read each entry twice, the second time slower, as if speed might be the thing keeping the meaning from landing fully. This wasn't a woman documenting her unhappiness. This was surveillance, patient, exact, conducted from inside a marriage he had assumed was one-directional, where he watched everyone and she watched no one. He had been wrong. She had been watching everyone too. She had simply never told him what she saw, because, as the second letter in the stack made clear, in handwriting slightly less composed than the first, I don't know who around you can be trusted with what I know. If I tell you directly and the wrong person hears it before you act on it, I become a problem someone needs to solve. So I'll write it down instead, and trust that someday you'll need to know all of it at once, rather than piece by piece, tipping our hand too early. Dario sat back slowly, the letter still in his hand, understanding arriving in a way that felt less like relief and more like the floor tilting beneath him. She hadn't been lonely. She hadn't been begging for his attention with pages he was too disciplined to read. She had been running her own quiet operation inside his own house for years because she trusted the information more than she trusted the men closest to him, men he'd shared tables with, business with, secrets with. Men like Salvatore Greco, whose name now appeared for the third time in a single letter, always in proximity to something that didn't add up. Dario had known Salvatore for 22 years. Had stood beside him at his father's funeral, had never once, in 2 decades, considered him anything but family. He reached for the next letter, his hands no longer entirely steady, already dreading and needing to know how many more times that name would appear before the stack ran out. The letter dated 3 years back was different from the others. Longer, the handwriting less controlled, as though it had been written in a single sitting, quickly, before her composure could talk her out of it. You remember the night the Bertoni shipment was seized at the border. You remember I was the one who told you I'd mentioned our travel plans to the wrong person at a dinner party. A careless mistake, a woman talking too freely about things that weren't hers to discuss. You were angry with me for weeks. You barely looked at me. I let you believe it, because the truth would have been worse. Dario stopped reading. He remembered that night with a clarity that surprised him, remembered the fury he'd felt, controlled but absolute, and the quiet way Elena had accepted his coldness afterward without defending herself. He had read her silence then as guilt. He had spent 3 years believing his wife had once, carelessly, cost the family nearly €500,000 and the trust of a Sicilian partner who never fully returned to the table. He kept reading. It wasn't me who talked. It was Salvatore. I found out 2 days after the seizure, from a man in Palermo who owed me a favor he didn't know he was repaying. Salvatore had sold the shipment's route for a price I still don't fully understand. If I'd told you the truth then, you would have gone to him directly, in anger, without proof, and he would have known someone was watching him. He would have disappeared, or worse, taken what he knew straight to the people paying him. So, I let you be angry with me instead. I let you believe I was careless, because your anger at me was safer than his knowledge that we suspected him. Dario's hand had gone still on the page. He thought of the man he'd actually punished for that leak. A young courier named Enzo, 23 years old, who had sworn until the end that he hadn't spoken to anyone about the shipment's route. Dario hadn't believed him. Dario had made an example of him in front of 11 other men, because someone had needed to pay, and Enzo had been the only name available. Elena had known. She had known and said nothing, not to protect Salvatore, but to protect the timeline, to keep him hidden a little longer, so she could gather more, while an innocent man paid a price that was never his to pay. Dario sat with that for a long time, the lamp burning low, understanding for the first time the actual weight of what he was holding. These weren't letters. They were 7 years of decisions made in his blind spot, sacrifices absorbed silently so that his own fury, when it finally arrived, would land on the right man instead of a convenient one. He had gotten it wrong once already. He reached for the next stack, aware now that he was running out of time to get it right the second time. The last stack was thinner than the others, only 4 letters, all written within the final 8 months of her life, the handwriting noticeably different from the composed script of earlier years. Faster, tighter, the handwriting of a woman who no longer had the luxury of careful patience. I know now. All of it. Not fragments, the whole structure. Salvatore isn't working alone, and he isn't the one giving the orders. He answers to someone inside this house, someone who sits at our table, someone you would never suspect because you raised him yourself. Dario read the line 3 times. She hadn't written the name. Even here, even at the end, she had held it back, and he understood why the moment he read the next paragraph. I won't write his name yet. If this letter is found before I'm ready, if the wrong person reads it too soon, it won't just be information anymore. It will be a death sentence for me, and it may not even reach you in time to matter. I need to be certain. I need proof that can't be argued with, not suspicion that gets buried the way Enzo's innocence got buried. I owe him that much, even now. The second-to-last letter was shorter, and something in its brevity frightened Dario more than any of the detail before it. Someone knows I've been asking questions. I don't know how much they know, or how close they are to understanding what I have. I should stop. I know I should stop. I'm not going to stop, because if I don't finish this, no one else ever will, and you'll spend the rest of your life trusting a man who's already decided you're worth less to him than money. Dario's hands had gone cold around the paper. The final letter was different from every one before it, shorter than all the rest, written on a single sheet, the handwriting steady again, deliberate, as though she had known this one might be the last and had chosen every word with total control. It wasn't dated. It wasn't addressed the way the others had been. This isn't for whenever you finally decide to open the drawer. This is for when you're ready to finish what I started. Everything you need is in the letters before this one. I couldn't finish it in time. I'm asking you to. Not for me. I won't be here to know if you did. For every person in this family who trusted you to protect them, the way I trusted you, even when you gave me every reason not to. Dario sat motionless for a long time after he finished reading. Then, for the first time since the funeral, his hand stopped shaking. He knew exactly what came next. Salvatore Greco was in his study when Dario arrived, unannounced, no guards trailing behind him. That alone should have told him everything. Dario. He rose from his chair too quickly, the kind of quickness that comes from a man whose instincts have been waiting years for a knock that never came, until tonight. I wasn't expecting. I know you weren't. Dario didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, hands loose at his sides, his voice carrying the same even register it always did. Men who didn't know him mistook that calm for softness. Salvatore knew better, and it was already written across his face. The Bertoni shipment, Dario said. 3 years ago. The route that got sold before it ever reached the border. Salvatore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We settled that. It was the courier. Enzo. Enzo was 23 years old and told me the truth 11 times before I stopped listening. Dario let the silence stretch a moment, watching it work on Salvatore the way silence always did. I killed an innocent man because I trusted you more than I trusted the evidence in front of me. Dario, whatever you think you know. I don't think. I know. He finally moved closer, each step unhurried. Elena knew too. She knew the day it happened. She let me destroy an innocent boy rather than let you realize she was watching because she needed you comfortable a little longer. She needed you to keep making mistakes until the pattern was undeniable. Salvatore's hand drifted, slow and deliberate, toward the drawer of his desk. Dario had expected it. Elena had written that he would. 22 years, Salvatore said quietly, and for a moment it almost sounded like grief. I gave this family 22 years. And you sold it for less than you were worth. Dario's voice never rose. That's the part one can't forgive. Not the betrayal. The price. It was over quickly and quietly, the way Dario had always preferred his business conducted. When it was finished, he stood alone in the room, breathing evenly, waiting for the satisfaction he'd expected to feel. It didn't come, because Salvatore, in his final moments, had said one more thing. Not a confession, not a plea, but a name. Offered almost as a final act of spite, a last card played by a man who had nothing left to lose. A name Dario had never once considered. A name that had sat at his own table for 15 years, held his son at a christening, stood beside him at Elena's grave with a hand on his shoulder that Dario had mistaken, until this exact moment, for grief. Matteo was in the garden when Dario found him. 3 days later, exactly where he always was in the evenings, a habit Dario had never once questioned in 15 years of watching him keep it. Their conversation was brief. Dario didn't need Salvatore's dying words to confirm what the pattern already told him once he finally allowed himself to see it, who had access to every room Elena described, who had known which nights Dario traveled, who had sat closest to him at the exact moments Elena's letters marked something going quietly wrong. Matteo didn't deny it long. Men rarely did, once Dario stopped raising questions and started stating facts. there was no rage in how it ended. Elena hadn't written with rage, and Dario found, standing in that garden, that he had no interest in becoming something she never was. Some things, he understood now, only needed to be said once, quietly, and finished. By the time the house was still again, there was no one left to hold accountable. No one left who required the truth delivered carefully, or delivered at all. The family Dario had spent his life protecting had been hollowed out from the inside for years by the very men he trusted most, and the only person who had seen the whole shape of it clearly had died writing letters to a husband too disciplined to open a drawer. That night, Dario sat at his desk the way he had 100 times before. Except now the drawer beside him was empty. Every letter read. Every name accounted for. He picked up a pen. He didn't know who the letter was for. Elena was gone. Nothing he wrote would reach her, would undo the years he'd spent locking her voice away unopened while she quietly kept him alive. But he wrote anyway, because for the first time in his life, Dario Moretti understood exactly what she must have felt every month, sealing an envelope she had no guarantee would ever be read. He wrote until the candle burned low. Then he folded the letter the way she always had, and placed it inside the drawer that had once cost him everything and would now hold the only truth he had left to give her. He never sent it. There was no one left who could receive it. But somewhere, in a house that had finally learned silence the hard way, a locked drawer held one last letter, the only one in that house ever written with nothing left to hide. So, here's the question I'll leave you with. If the person who loved you most chose to stay silent, absorbing the danger meant for you, just to keep you alive a little longer, would you ever forgive yourself for not listening sooner? Or is that the kind of debt that follows you long after the letters are finally read?